Good evening to one and all present here. On behalf of Curating for Culture, I extend a very warm welcome to all those who have joined us today on this Saturday evening. I am Sanjana Girish Yechireddy, and I am joined by my colleagues today, Vallabhi Jalan, who is my co-moderator for the evening, and of course, Ishita Shah. So Curating for Culture has emerged out of collaborations and initiatives explored by Ishita Shah around various cities and projects ranging across disciplines. So Curating for Culture is a collective of many diverse individuals who are all passionate about cultural issues. We have had 23 participants join us for a series of workshops this week that we will talk about in this presentation. And we have with us today 12 participants who are very eager to present their insights from these workshops. So just to set the agenda for this session, Vallabhi and myself will give a brief overview of the pandemic archive, and we'll tell you everything that we've been up to up until today. Then we will have presentations by participants for 3 minutes each. And after the presentations are complete, we will enter into a dialogue where we will pose questions to both participants and audience members. And the idea is to have an exchange between all of us. Over to you, Vallabhi.
Thank you, Sanjana. Good evening, everyone. I'm Vallabhi. Taking things forward from here. So, in the month of April, we felt that announcing any new call for proposals wouldn't be fair because all of us were together going through very troubled phase. In May, we were wondering how we can help as cultural practitioners. After much deliberation, we wish to channelize our care and concern into an open access public archive. And we appealed to contribute stories in various forms. And the intention was to provide a safe space for all of us to share stories, emotions resulting from the pandemic. Through our social media posts, we aim to encourage the audience to think about and question the importance of archiving the pandemic. Our friends helped us to translate the appeal to reach out to a larger crowd. In May, we announced the call for a workshop. The intention was to make it as a platform for the interested participants to engage, collaborate, and immerse themselves on issues related to archiving and curating the collective memories of the pandemic. Over to you, Sanjana.
So over the past week, we've had a series of 4 workshops led by different facilitators who we invited to lead these conversations. So our first workshop was with photographer and bookmaker Dayanatha Singh. Dayanatha Singh really encouraged us to think about the intentions behind archiving the pandemic, and she also led participants through exercises using newspaper clippings. For our second session, we welcomed Dr. Rebecca A. Adelman from the University of Maryland. So Dr. Adelman is the founder of the Coronavirus Lost and Found Project, an archive that holds people's stories of the pandemic. And she really shared insights on how to construct this archive. And for the session, participants engaged in exercises involving how to think about collecting stories of other people. Our third session was with Avantika Seth and Ben Gillespie, both oral historians. So here we really try to think through the process of collecting oral histories and how to grapple with difficult questions of grief and trauma, along with all the other diverse emotions that this pandemic has raised within all of us. And for our last and final session, we welcomed Banshan Lang Marvin. Banshan shared his experience working on the Kalam project led by the Northeast Audiovisual Archive. So for he shared with us stories of how he documented rural life in the Khasi Hills of Meghalaya from the months the pandemic has begun. And by narrating the stories of people he archived, Banshan led us to think about how to capture the nuances and diverse experiences of the pandemic. So now we will move on to the presentations by our workshop participants, where participants will really share the insights, the lessons that they have gained from these past 4 sessions. So to begin with, we have Mithul. Mithul, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjana. Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Mithul Kajaria. I'm a photo artist and curator based in Ahmedabad. I work with an institution called Navjeevan Trust, which is a Gandhian Institute, a press he began in the early 20th century. My work up until now with archives has been in two forms. A part of my art practice, where archives is something I use to look inwards more than outwards, and more in the form of a work in a formal position working with institutional archives, one of which is Navjeevan Archives. I got involved in this workshop with the intention of learning more about inclusive public archives in the context of the pandemic. There were stories I had accumulated over time which I needed to share, and I thought this was a good first step to figure out how to do that. But during the course of the workshop, I noticed I was taking a step back from the role of a contributor and began engaging more from the position of an archivist. I came to notice certain aspects about an archive documenting the pandemic that didn't necessarily hold true for other archives that we usually come across. A general understanding of an archive is a collection of historical documents or records. But in case of a pandemic archive, what does it mean to gather experiences, stories, and narratives that often would be very personal in nature, still have a universal relatability to them, but doing all of that while we, the archivists, contributors, viewers, readers, listeners, are still living through the crisis, are still living through the pandemic. One of the exercises during the workshop was to record and collect stories from our family members, from community around. And to be honest, in the beginning, I didn't feel very comfortable doing that. I didn't feel comfortable asking someone to dig into their memory to recount an experience which they might not want to. Narrating or verbalizing something that has been difficult in the past often means having to relive that memory. And again, in this case, what happens if the memory is not entirely formed, if it's too fresh? This chain of thought concretized the importance and the responsibility of an archivist who's working, you know, towards a pandemic archive, towards of an archivist towards the contributor of a pandemic archive. Uh, there was another session where we went through the Edelman session, I think, where we went through public archives that were present around the pandemic. And it was intense going through those stories, through listening to those stories. And I started questioning myself if I was ready to, if I was in the right mind space as an audience to listen or to read through those stories, which further led to another question of whether the the care and the empathy we offer the contributor, does it need to be extended towards the audience? Does it make sense to add trigger warnings when we put up pieces that we've collected, just so that the viewer or listener can take an informed call whether which either if they want to get engaged with it or which of the pieces would they want to get engaged with. These are the few questions I came across. I don't have answers to them yet. I'm not even sure if these are questions which can be resolved with a one answer fits all solution. But they felt to me as important questions I need to ask myself if I'm planning on working on this project. And I hope that makes sense to you or whoever intends to work on creating a public archive around the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mithil. So next we have Debunkita, who is currently unable to join us this evening. So we will be playing a short video for her with her recorded presentation.
Good
Can I
evening,
confirm
everyone.
that you are able to hear and listen to this?
Yes, Sanjana.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm Debunkita Dash, and I'm a researcher in history at University of Hyderabad. The workshop sessions I attended, organized by Curating for Culture, has actually helped me to learn the journey of archiving, and it was an enriching experience because throughout the process I have found myself. It was a discovery actually of a long lost conversation with my own self. Initially, I thought of documenting and archiving my family members' journey, but as I started working with my own hand, with the art forms available around me, I found these old hoarded newspapers. um pre-pandemic actually, that actually had headlines um, relevant to my emotions and experiences that I went throughout the pandemic, that I felt actually. So and with the compilation process, I found this was actually tracing my journey, and I could like realize it then while compilation, and this was not intended before. So from homecoming that felt empty, to have gone through the season of fear, pain, trauma, to the death, collective grief, and personal losses, as well as making health the biggest priority, to have gone into deep silence, as well as embracing after a certain point of time to the elements of change, that is through recognizing and being empathetic to different kind of voices, sound, and it made the sense of a beginning of my like away from the pandemic. So I tried to write, I practiced music, and this actually became the site of my resistance against the chaos, uh, in against the chaos that my mind was creating. So yeah, and with the realization of taking one day at a time and making it a matter of faith, I believed in like myself. I started believing in myself, and this actually resulted in finding a space of solidarity for my emotions that would otherwise have been suppressed forever. Now I would like to end my presentation with the sounds of rain and splashing water that I had documented, uh, that felt very close to me. And but I could not document other kinds of sounds, since the elements of sounds, voice and face is tough to remember and difficult to compile, and also it is overwhelming sometimes. So here it is. Thank you.
So I think what we have here is as both Debunkita and Mithul have raised very personal questions that archivists have faced when dealing with the pandemic. And as Debunkita beautifully put it, she found doing this, uh, going through these practices, a form of resistance against the chaos she was facing. So we're going to return back to these slides. If you can give me 1 minute. All right. So after Debunkita, we have Ansi. Ansi, over to you.
So I'll tell you to change the slide.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Please tell me as you want me to move.
Yeah.
Shall I move to the next slide?
No.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, of course.
I'm Ansi. I'm a researcher based in Delhi, and I'm here to share the problems regarding archiving oneself. So next slide. So we were given this assignment during the workshop, and this is the first draft of my entry. During the pandemic, time has become warped. I cannot seem to remember which day it is. So I use more reminders and alarms to remind myself of any of the virtual events that I've signed up. Next slide. So the problems that I've been facing while archiving myself is due to me being an overthinking introvert. So the Anita Singh in her session told us that if you're an overthinker, you should just follow your intuition while archiving, just follow your heart and things would be all right. And but as an overthinker, my process is mulling over the tiniest of details and hating presenting on public platforms such as these, and berating myself over the way I said things or did not say things. Next slide. So Mr. Robot is a web series that I have been watching for the past few weeks. It's basically about a vigilante hacker and the struggles that he has been facing. So after finishing the series, I was left with this question of who the real Elliot Alderson is. Next slide. And I'm relating it to my problems that I was facing while building an archive, that I will never know the real person with just a conversation, and the problem of a sanitized version. of documentation. And I'm also facing the dilemma of being versus doing while documenting and asking the question, who am I really documenting myself for? Next slide. So in conclusion, I feel that it is way easier to document others than to document myself. And asking the question, is having a narrative better than having no narrative at all? And to also ask, why did I place Mr. Robot in the middle of this PPT? Maybe to just nudge you to watch Mr. Robot or use it as a coping mechanism in this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ansi. We will definitely pay heed to that recommendation. Next up, we have Aparna. Aparna, over to you.
Hi. So thanks, Sanjana. I've been thinking about an archive. The one had been brewing for me, which prompted me to join this workshop, was an archive of things that may not be directly related to the pandemic, but in a way are inevitably tinted by it. So I've been thinking about this in relation to my own work, which I will talk about in a bit. But these are essentially exercises that what I'm presenting in this little short snippet here is really my inquiry into material that direct questions or prompts about the pandemic may not be able to excavate quite easily. So can we go to the next one? Gender is like the first, go-to thing for me. So I've been thinking about concerns like displacement or confinement, things that are already affect women's lives in various degrees. I wondered what continuities it has once the pandemic strikes in at different times for different people. So if I were to ask this question, the results I had were quite fascinating. Can we go to the next one, please? So there's this concern about space still, a conversation that's not exactly, this is an anonymized account, a concern that's not necessarily about the pandemic, but it's about space, which is nonetheless linked to the pandemic. Can we go to the next one?
Just give me a minute. Okay, there we go.
So again, there's a certain sorority that comes about, which seemingly has nothing to do with the pandemic, but it has. Can we go to the next one? Now, this I bring also to my own work. Something that I started doing during the course of the lockdown or pandemic. They are not direct. The iconography in these paintings is not directly sourced from the usual images that we saw around us of masks or oxygen, etc. But can we go to the next one? And yet somehow, please stay with this for a second. Somehow there's a sense, if we look at them from the lens of the pandemic, there are motifs that come about, like a sense of emptiness, or please go to the next one and just scroll through them. A sense of a kind of emptiness of space where things seem suspended without much context. There's also a slight skewing of perspective. Things are bigger in relation to other things. Sanjana, can we go back to the first one, please? Yes, this, for example, is particularly interesting to me when I look back at it, because it uses two pictures as reference. One is, but what connects these pictures is a kind of inaccessibility of touch. One is temporally and spatially. So one is a picture from when I was in lockdown of my mother holding the rabbit, and one is a picture from childhood. So I don't know what the conclusion of this is really, but the idea is that I'm really quite interested in that negative space where things are not directly focused on the pandemic, but are inextricably linked to it, are underlined by it. Yeah, it's still in the making, and hopefully some clarity will come over the next few months. Thank you. Can we go to the last slide? There's a small question I've left there.
This one, right?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Parna, for raising this very important question. Next up, we have Saloni. Over to you, Saloni.
Yeah. Thank you, Sanjana. Hello, I am Saloni Mahajan. I'm a recent interior design graduate. And through this workshop, I wanted to understand the process and need of archiving, and also get a sense of self, find connections in the material that I've created over the past 1.5 years, which were responses to the pandemic, but not directly related to them. So two kind of questions that kept coming back to me while I was trying to ideate the archive. One was, how does my archive help others? Like, what does it inform others? Not just right now, but also 100 or 1,000 years from now. Can you go to the next slide? So this was my response to a session with Debunkita Singh. So through this session, I found the two parallel stories with a contradictory content in them. And as the session progressed, I found myself intuitively making patterns and forms in these clippings. And the question I was left with after the session was, what is the sort of form that I can sustain through an archive? Can you go to the next slide? So I went through my personal documentation, and I tried to find a sustainable subject or a form, and I found faces to be kind of a link. And it led me to think, why are there faces coming up again and again? So maybe it was because that we were feeling this sort of disconnect, and faces are familiar to us and we feel comfort in them. And initially they were extremely derivative, and they were preconceived ideas of people that I saw around me, but gradually the semblance of faces as human faces, they started to fade away. Can you go to the next slide? And they became more emotive and bleak, and this sense of continuity started to emerge from them. And it made me question that if this continuity reflected human connections in any sort, and this disconnect that I was feeling from everybody else. And up until this point, like, my idea of an archive is very personal, but this also led me to think in the discussions with Rebecca, ma'am. Can you go to the next slide, please, Sanjana? And the discussions with Rebecca, ma'am, also kind of instilled in me an idea of a public experience archive, and maybe this idea of disconnect, maybe I'm not just the one who's feeling it, and others are also feeling it. And if this experience could be extended to the public, and we could question the ideas of familiarity and unfamiliarity through an exercise of parallels. Also, we talked about triggers during the workshop, and how a simple word, a simple image can trigger the audience in different ways. So these are just some images which can have different responses by different people, and elicit a sense of maybe a familiar response or an unfamiliar response. So yeah, the question still remains, how am I going, like, how does this help others? And if at all it does. But yeah, like, it does not directly talk about the pandemic, but it stems from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Saloni. I think the patterns between your artwork and the connection between the questions of familiarity and disconnect are very fascinating.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Mahweesh, who is joining us from Lahore this evening. Mahweesh, over to you.
Thank you. Hi. I'm an architect and an academic. I teach architectural history, architecture design, and architecture journalism. And I'm also an aspiring doctoral student. My past experience with archives is setting up a very small archive at the Institute for Art and Culture in Lahore, and also my experience with the CPA. And this experience was to, still keeping on that relationship that I had with CPA, and also to document and experience the pandemic that is here and how we are viewing it, that is happening in India also. Next slide, please. First and foremost, I'd just let you know that what does this archive would contain. It would contain WhatsApp conversations, which will be a result, which was a result from the search of the keywords that I did in my phone. And those keywords were like pandemic, COVID-19, and Corona. Then the other the other thing that this archive will contain is the people's narratives, which was a result of the session that we had, which was session number 2, and that as a result of the interviewing my friends over the WhatsApp. And the third thing is my own artistic practice and response to an exhibit, which sort of resulted as a call for creating a process or showing a process towards the quarantine and towards the lockdown by the method of art making as a public archive. Next slide, please. This archive is for academics, archivists, artists, theorists, visual artists, and researchers, change maker, research methodology innovators. Next slide, please. So as a point number 1, that what this archive would contain are these WhatsApp conversations, which have inherently become a part of our conversations and our WhatsApp messages. And what I did was to sort of look into the archive that WhatsApp contains in itself by searching the keywords like COVID vaccine, Corona, and pandemic. And all those conversations that we've had for the one last year would pop up. Next slide, please. The next bit was for me as a outcome of the session number 2 that I had with the workshop, in which we were asked to sort of ask questions and have interviews with our friends, and pose questions. Then I sort of also mapped what kind of people that I'm talking to, and what are their backgrounds, which are highlighted on the screen. And those are the questions that I posed. Next slide, please. So in doing so, I also tried to keep on changing the questions. The questions ranged from how did you feel in the pandemic? What clothes were you wearing? Since you were working in the from home, how did you feel? What are the keywords? And these kind of things. Next slide, please. The larger questions were that especially from one of my friends who is based in Bombay. My question was that what is your day like in pandemic in contrast to your day before as an architect in Bombay? And that is the kind of narrative that I received. Next slide, please. Yeah, we can go ahead. Next slide, please. The third bit is rather something, which I sort of went back to as a response to the session 3 that I had with the workshop, creating pandemic archives. And it was as a response to a call for exhibition by a curator which is based in Islamabad for exhibiting the process of meaning-making art practice. And you can just run through, Sanjana, I can read it out. You can just run through the slides.
Okay.
So I exhibited the piece that actually originated from my thoughts in my journals from 23rd March 2020 to March 2021. And this work is dedicated to my four-legged baby whom I lost just last December. This work also explores the creation of the ethnographical field through a participative approach that engages with the visitor, creating a moment, a text, and an action that all ends. It is an endeavor to create a public archive, which is done in an instant, in a moment, a process of art making. This work explores the ideas of manipulation of ethnographical fields through the process of exhibition, the interaction of the visitor with the art piece, and the notions of loss, grief, and the cyclical motion of thoughts, and they reach closure if they do. The installation investigated symbols, signs, and treads very carefully on ideas of public art and archive. And this, as a response to the third session, is something that I thought that responds to the point of creating an archive and what should go into an archive, and how archives could be probably decolonized and how archives could be probably rethought. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahweesh. I think similar to Aparna, you've showed us how these everyday conversations happening over social media have so much insights to offer us about the pandemic. And I think your presentation really brought out the interaction between the textual and the visual as well.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Namnith. Namnith, are you here?
Hello.
Hello. Hi. Over to you.
Yes. Hi. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Namnith Kalve. I currently work as a museum researcher, and I have engaged with the archives at NID at an institutional level. I'm going to take you through how I arrived from a personal archive to a public archive during my engagement with the Curating for Culture workshop. In 2018, I had started working towards documenting stories of personal Polaroid photographs and writing about them. In my conversations with others, I noticed how some stories kept coming back. These stories were nice. I wanted to put them up for people to read and for me to go back to. As a repository of connecting anecdotes, I started with another page called Stories. I wanted these anecdotes to connect back to a larger narrative existing before the coming of the COVID-19 pandemic. To begin with, I started going through the posts I had written on the Polaroids page just in case if I come across a few connecting threads. Next page. After every workshop, when I went back to the activity that we did, I got more and more sure about the idea of building a pandemic public archive. The purpose and intention, I realized, will keep constantly evolving with every person who has shared that experience that I've written or has read about it. Last year in 2020, when I started with the pandemic personal archive, I was living away from my family and also documenting myself. However, I let go of that idea when I did not see it serving a bigger purpose. I've come to realize that just like museums, archives also come in varied forms and ways, not limiting to photography, but also including shared living experiences. Next slide. Beginning from the first session with Debunkita Singh towards the end with Banshan Marwain, I kept going back to my personal archive. The process brought me to questions like where does an archive stop and in what detail does one go while putting together an archive? As a response to create a pandemic public archive, questions like how do you define the content of an archive from a public to a private archive, or how do you disengage from a personal archive kept coming up. Next slide. The Curating for Culture workshop has collectively helped me look a step ahead of the process I was in and helped me build a temporary form to what I was doing. For developing the public archives on pandemic in India, I intend to document the experiences under a sub-theme called senses. It is a response to the situation around me through the 5 human senses when the COVID-19 pandemic began, continued, and remains. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Namnith. Up next, we have Rukmini.
Hi, I'm Rukmini. I come from an art history and visual culture background. I am currently I'm currently doing a lot of textile research, and over this past year, I've been also exploring a lot with sound, especially recording the sounds of one particular bus route in Bangalore. So last year, I had taken part in one of Ishita's workshops, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And when I saw this call, I immediately decided to take part and see what it was all about. Could you go to the next slide, please? So in one of the exercises we were told to do was to interview other people. And I think this was the second exercise. And I found this extremely hard because most people said that they had nothing to share. Of course, this comes from most people say, oh, who am I and what's my story? That's one part. But the other thing is, I think it's also very linked to the pandemic and many things that we're all experiencing nowadays, is that a sense of numbness. And I think the lack of something special, which makes you feel like you have nothing to share. So I decided to just ask some simple questions to people, and starting with their daily surroundings and how they spend their day. And I myself did this exercise for myself. And could you go to the next slide, please?
Do you want me to play the...
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, I didn't see the sound thing here. So I recorded the sounds of a couple of parts of my house. And since I spent so much time at home, like most people, I became a lot more aware of my surroundings and started listening, I guess, compared to hearing. And so I've recorded a couple of sounds that are here, which one is stitching, the other one is of my kitchen. Yeah. Could you play them? No, you don't have to play them for too long. Yeah. Yeah, and the other one was of the kitchen. Yeah, I just wanted to say that maybe something that the pandemic has taught all of us is that since our everyday is so different now, that perhaps even archiving our everyday is as exceptional in these times. And I think somewhere during the course of our workshop, one of the speakers, I think Ben, in his workshop, he was asking people how they'd like to be remembered in another 100 years. And when I heard this, I could feel the weight of it. And which brings us to many questions about how we would like to be remembered and who gets to decide that. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Rukmini, for leaving us with those questions to ponder on. Next up, we have a video by one of our participants, Ridhima. Ridhima has recorded a presentation for us, which I will play now. Please tell me if you are able to listen.
Good evening, everyone. Today I'm going to play the role of movie character Mr. India in an attempt to be a part of this event. Firstly, much gratitude to all of you for pairing up with me for the next 3 minutes. I sincerely hope to contribute something meaningful and take away much more. To start with my own journey, I think I have this habit of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So from being in New York back when it was the epicenter of this pandemic to arriving in Delhi at the very hour of chaos, I did document some parts of my journey and my experiences. But when I came to this workshop, I was very reluctant on whether we should be collecting these stories, mostly of grief and trauma. It was during our second session of the workshop that Dr. Rebecca's words helped me ease my reluctance, I would say, when she talked about the risk of erasing all the grief. And so it started making sense for me. In our second session, we were asked to interview 2 or more persons, whether family or friends or anyone, which made me think who I wanted to speak to. So the questions then led me to choose to document the emotions and narratives of children aged between 8 to 16. I remember there was a reporter barging his mic on the face of a child around 11-year-old to showcase his grief or mental status. There was no empathy or even the courtesy to tackle this subject of asking a child questions about his situation with care or diligence, but rather a nerve wracking experience as if they were not presenting news but some kind of cheap soap opera. So, in my opinion, when we work upon creating this archive for posterity, it becomes critically crucial to account their thoughts, mental processes, ideas, notions, musings at this particular point as the world acclimates to this watershed moment for good and for bad. As we move along, there are still several challenges and doubts and self doubts on how to approach these children. Should I be even doing this? What would it do? But so far, I've been surprised to know that my 9-year-old and 16-year-old cousins have so much to share, so much which we wouldn't usually be asking in normal day conversations. So, with this project, I just hope to bring these voices to a platform where people can acknowledge, people can know these stories and what's going inside the mind of these children. That's all. Thank you.
I must add here that Ridhima, despite her difficult circumstances, has managed to send us something, and we're grateful for her insights as well. I'm going to return back to our slides and proceed. Next up, we have Palak. Palak,
hi everyone. Okay, thank you so much for giving this opportunity. And so I come from a background of creative content strategy, working with in a typical agency environment. And this exercise was a little different for me as it required a different kind of documentation of experiences. And I did not use the visual form that I usually use. So it's an archive of the contributions I got from family and friends by doing this exercise that was assigned in the session too. And we can move on, Sanjana. Yeah. So basically how I went about it is I messaged these 3 questions to my friends and close family members, where I was trying to look at what are the emotional stages that you went through during the pandemic. How did you feel about the sense of time? And what would you tell to someone about the pandemic 100 years here on? And these are the questions and some of the responses that I've captured. And I realized the multitude of responses that came into being. You can move on to the next slide.
Shall I play the clip, Palak?
Yes. I think there's a lag, so it's just coming later.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this account who was pregnant during the pregnancy and just a little bit of what her experience was like.
Hey Palak, okay, so to answer your questions, what are the different emotional stages that you went through during the pandemic? I think for me personally, it was a tough emotional period because I had my entire pregnancy during the pandemic as well as had a baby, so I was a new mom. And I think I've mostly oscillated between feeling extremely sad and lonely and, almost bad about missing, not enjoying this phase of my life with the people I'm closest to because I was alone and, there was no one around me. So I've oscillated between feeling really, really low and also feeling really grateful that I was spared COVID, that I've been healthy throughout, that I still have a job and I still have my family safe. So, it kind of oscillates between being grateful and being really upset and lonely and depressed. What did you feel about the sense of time? I think for me personally, that time.
So this is an account of Saurav, who is an MBA student and who was just looking at it from the point of view of numbers and the cases and was just literally looking at the graphs and the charts of the numbers. And it was a completely different and however logical approach he took, it was difficult for him to understand what was happening. We can move on to the next response.
पेंडेमिक जब स्टार्ट हुआ, लॉकडाउन स्टार्ट हुआ और मेरे बच्चे मेरे साथ घर पर इतना टाइम स्पेंड किया, इवन मेरी बेटी और मेरे दामाद भी यहीं पर थे, तो वो फर्स्ट 2 months तो पार्टी जैसा लग रहा था, कहना नहीं चाहिए। सिचुएशन अच्छी नहीं थी देश के लिए, लेकिन हम लोग घर में डिशेस बना बना के एंजॉय कर रहे थे। रोज स्वीट डिश, आम, केक बन रहे, तो हमने बहुत एंजॉय किया। और साथ साथ बच्चों ने काम भी बहुत किया क्योंकि मेड नहीं थी। जितना टाइम फैमिलीज़ ने एक साथ बिताया, बच्चों का वर्क फ्रॉम होम था और सब ने बहुत अच्छा टाइम स्पेंड किया। फिर थिंग्स नॉर्मलाइज होने लग गई और मेड की एंट्री भी, एक मेड को बुलाना भी शुरू कर दिया, नॉर्मल हो गया। लेकिन अब जो सेकंड फेज कोरोना का आया, इसमें तो मतलब इतनी डेथ सुनी है कि रोज कोई ना कोई न्यूज़ एक दो सुनाई देती है। और इवन हमारे क्लोज एक मेरे हस्बैंड का कज़न, मासी का बेटा ही, वो 56 इयर्स का था, उसकी भी डेथ हुई। तो बहुत ही दुख भरा फेज है ये। किसी के हमारे नॉन एक
So here the narrative went from being extremely happy to completely, like, when the situation changed with the second wave. Moving on to the narrative from Rupali was more about how COVID disrupted the notion of time and space for her, because she was confined to her bedroom and the bed was the working space, the space to talk to friends and to do everything else, and whether it was Netflix, etc. And she brings in a different kind of, and you all can probably access some of these recordings if that interests you later. And I'll move on to the next response. Yeah. So this is an anonymous account that I got from another Indian student studying abroad, and the whole feeling of helplessness when you're not in the country and you're reading those newspaper clippings and watching everything that is happening in the country as a news piece, and you're concerned about your parents and your and she also went through a phase wherein the family was affected with COVID, and the complete loss of control for somebody who actually has like a serious amount of OCD was her narrative. Yeah, moving on.
Guys, can we skip the recording? We are over time, Palak. We'll come to your reflections.
I think we can move on to, sorry. I think in interest of time, we can move on to the reflections and leave. Okay, so the key takeaway here, like from the first session, where the first question was how to look at an archiving project from a long-term perspective, and Dayanita Singh asked many of these important questions and made us look through the lens of, like, two things that she told us was sustainability and intention. And a lot of projects, I think emotional, intellectual, and financial, for me personally, those have been, like, the areas I've not considered as much while starting a project. So those are the things that she left us with, and that I found really intriguing. Yeah. So I'll just speak about it, assuming that the second point is on your screen. And so she spoke about something like, this one sentence that stayed with me was, when an archive is over, like what is the deadline or the boundaries you set for yourself, and how to look at these boundaries and, to work on those kind of constraints. So with her project, she's kept a deadline of till we heal from Corona. And that was interesting to me at a point where we are all, like, running the risk of, like, normalizing all the grief and loss that has taken place. And how do we go about looking at it as we are documenting something which is like, a live experience or a living experience. Yeah. Okay, assuming that the third takeaway is on your screen. So how do we go about archiving and how to get people talking is, so these are the two quotes that I remember from the sessions that Ben and Avantika took, and wherein he said that silence is a great weapon. When silence gets awkward on Zoom, people start talking, and Avantika keeps on, like, rechecking, doing a sense check while interviewing, and I found those approaches really really helpful in kind of engaging with archiving, or like getting these interviews or bites for documentation of oral history or visual as well. So yeah, and moving on to the observations, I just feel that the people I interviewed belong to the same family, almost like a same family, almost same age group. Some of them are like family members, so older, but also the same economic class. But there's a whole spectrum of variation of experiences that each of us went through in the same household, and the views are also representative of what they are experiencing right now while they look at their past. So if somebody has experienced like a loss, or like has had a near troublesome experience, that is also representative of this state. So we just I just wanted to add that bit, and then there is my own hesitation to go back to my own experiences of the pandemic past, and I am not able to go back and do justice to that. So yeah, so that's about it. I think I took too much time, and sorry for that, but yeah.
That's all right, Palak. Thank you for showing us a diversity of experiences in your clippings.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Namnith. Over to you, Namnith.
Thank you, Sanjana. I'm Namnith Kaur Ahuja. I'm Namnith Kaur Ahuja, working as an independent photographer and a researcher archivist at Faridabad Industries Archive. Idea of attending this workshop was to deal with my emotions, my silence, and trying to recover from a series of unfortunate events in this COVID times. And second, I found this call of archiving pandemic important, considering not only personal memories are important, every kind of details in making may become an analytical tool for all sort of sciences, humanities, other criticalities and discipline. And it may serve a very simple purpose to return to ease of life in any torn neighborhood. During this workshop, we picked up a couple of activities, but to break my silence and to start fresh, I thought of choosing the medium of phone conversation with few close connections. So here first, I'm sharing a part of one of such audios, a person who always starts conversation with a very positive note. He always says in Hindi like, बहुत बढ़िया वक्त है, बहुत जीवन समय है, चिंतन का, मनन का, पढ़ने का, लिखने का. However, like currently my mind and body not having that luxury to settle down with this free available time. Sanjana, can we please play the audio first?
Yes. Yeah. I will play from 1 minute, 7 seconds onwards.
Yes, please. Thank you.
पिछले साल वही 25 को क्या?
Yep. There we go.
बहुत ही बढ़िया समझ कि जिसे मैं मेरी की मेरे जीवन में से कल्पना मेरी आएगा कि जो हम कह सकता हूँ मैं सब कर दूँ आपकी बैकग्राउंड देखी सच में इसमें ये है कि 5,000 साल से नवनीत समाज में जो विभाजन हुआ है वो काफी पीड़ा भी साथ में दी हुआ सबके लिए मैं वो उसमें दास की बात नहीं दास की ऐसी स्वामी पीड़ा के आपने पूरे महाकाव्य हमारे सामने ठीक है ना जी तो उसके बाद में जो देखते हैं कि उसके बाद में चलते आए हैं तो ये पिछले 30-40 या 50 साल से तो ऐसी स्थिति बन रही थी कि आया जो अगर हम लोग नई समाज रचना जिसमें विभाजित समाज नहीं हो अगर मानव प्रजाति नहीं कर पाएगी तो पृथ्वी पे जीवन ही मतलब दाव पे लगता जा रहा है ये स्थितियां बन रही थी और अब भी मतलब उसमें तो और छूट फूटा कहीं खरीद रहे हो कहीं कुछ कर रहे हो तो दुनिया भर में ये चीज है तो लेकिन वो जो आप कह सकते हैं कि संभावनाएं बहुत कम है और जो आप कह सकते हैं कि
पिछले साल
we can stop Sanjana, it's okay. Yeah. It's just to give an idea, So following that call, next day I shared a poem with the same person in WhatsApp, a poem on pandemic I found on the web and how it led to further conversation in the chat. Later, during another call, he invited me to have face-to-face conversation. I still have to go. But the thing is, so one thing led to another. I usually use photos, documents, and personal interviews. Majorly, I'm into photo reading, and now with this workshop and to do this some sort of activities during the workshop, I see my shift from phone audio to chat messages and even notes from the internet, like other posts. And I also feel that now I'm open to few other tools which we were introduced and exchanged during this workshop. Yet, I would say that I'm in the process and not defining or deciding upon a particular format for myself. But definitely now I see a broader space. However, it is also important to decide what, how, and the purpose of doing this entire exercise. Yes. Thank you, Sanjana. I think we can go to the second slide where I'm sharing that. Yeah. So in WhatsApp chat, we shared, that conversation kept going on, and it gave clarity, it gave hope. It also allowed me to have conversation, which, as I said, like I was dealing with my silence. I'll close here. Thank you, Sanjana.
Thank you so much, Namnith, for these insights and for sharing your clip. Next up, we have Lavanya. Lavanya, are you here, or would you like me to play the recording for your presentation? Vallabhi, could you please check if Lavanya is here?
Yeah, she is here.
Can we make her the co-host? Is she there?
She's already the
Yeah,
co-host.
I can see. Yeah, she is.
Okay.
Not able to.
Lavanya, are you able to hear us?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
We can hear you, Lavanya. There's a slight disturbance. Could you speak a bit louder?
Okay, is this better?
Hello?
Very faint.
Very faint, yeah.
Oh, that's strange. Hello, is this better?
Still very, very faint.
Oh my God. I don't know what to do.
Okay, do you want me to share your recording for the presentation? Would that be all right?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, all right. All right, yeah. So Lavanya has also submitted, anticipating these difficulties, Lavanya has also submitted a recording of her presentation that we will share. Just give me 1 minute. Already, Vallabhi, this is already on the drive, right?
Yes, yes.
I
think scroll down.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one, the blue one. On top. Lavanya.
Okay.
Yeah. Here. Lavanya. It's written.
Yeah. Let me just give me 1 minute.
Irritate mat karo yaar.
Lavanya, I'm a filmmaker. Apologies, I couldn't be
Can
there
people hear this?
internet.
It's a bit faint still.
Hi, my name is Lavanya. I'm a filmmaker.
That's good. Better.
Net issues. So during this work, I was asked to collect people's experiences of the pandemic, and I posed a question about two people about what is their sense of time during the past few months. And these are some of the responses I got. These are pictures, sketches of a bar magnet to a person looking out at the ocean. And the responses had very interesting visuals for me. Somebody said time has shifted shapes now in the last few months.
It feels like a bar magnet's spiraling magnetic field. Somebody spoke of time as ice melting white on white, they called it. Somebody said nothing had really changed for them. The sense of time was based on events in the house. It was not really based on passing of weeks or days. Another person was surprised that they didn't hear the rice cooker go off and the rice got burnt. Was I engrossed in numbness? Was I defying time, or was it altogether another time? Another person spoke of it as a frozen peak. It's an image of death or future. There is no future. I had collated all these responses and shared it among the group, and then a chain of events started. Everyone started messaging back with more articles on time. Some wanted to revise their thoughts. Some had strong disagreements with others. Some really resonated with each other. Some had used, in fact, exact same words. Some of the responses to their own response was everybody sounding dazed. This exercise confirms for me that time is nothing but an individual sense. Now I feel more present. Later, I was put on a spot when people asked me about my take on the question of time. I chose to put in black and white photographs of all my objects that had broken down during the lockdown. And to that I got was, why is it in black and white? Is this a log of your home repairs? Are you okay? For the future, I'm thinking of using the practice and methodology of building an archive to collect material from various collaborators and stitch it together as a collective thought or a film. Some of the challenges are the various mediums in which people usually respond, how to put it all together, how to build a more diverse pool of collaborators, what communication platform to use to reach out, because WhatsApp the responses turned out to be very scattered, and finding common themes. The dilemmas are trauma triggers, hoarding digital space, and also collaborators, sometimes strong disagreement with each other. Some of major takeaways for me was building an archive is an exercise in building sustained dialogue with people. It's also looking at the various layers in which people become aware of their own response and tend to reflect and self-reflect. How do you catch or record or archive a strange, spontaneous moment in which the entire group responded? I also felt the anonymity gave a lot of freedom to the participants because they were freed from categories of age, gender, profession, location. My another thought is, how does an archive complement filmmaking? Sometimes I feel it's oppositional, but sometimes they do come together. And yeah, my personal takeaway through this entire thing is I still don't have a sense of closure with what I started with this group of friends. Yeah, thank you. And perhaps Sanjana can play the clip for you guys. Thank you.
Okay. That is what we have from Lavanya. We shall now. Oh no, just kidding. Apologies for slight delay. So with Lavanya's presentation, we have now come to an end of our presentations. We must say that as you've seen in the presentations, our participants have brought their diverse experiences, backgrounds, creative practice to this. And we've all really tried to strike a balance between processing the present, because the pandemic is far from over for all of us, as we know, and between archiving for the future. And as you've seen, our participants have put a lot of effort in creating these presentations and sharing their insights from the workshops with us, but they've also really put in a lot of emotional energy in sustaining these dialogues, because we've all been grappling with our own difficulties with the pandemic. And just to add, what you've seen is just the beginning, and we hope to continue building these projects. Now we want to transition from the individual insights that participants have showed us to broader questions on what does it mean to build a public archive of the pandemic that Curating for Culture is trying to do. So we will now like to open the floor for a dialogue between participants of the workshop and audience members. We will pose a question, so anybody can jump in if they have to share their insights on these questions. To ensure like a smooth flow of conversation, please use the chat function only to pose a question so we can raise it to the audience. But if you want to respond, you can either respond in the chat or raise your hand, and Wallaby will ensure that everybody's responses are heard. So to open the dialogue with the first set of questions, this has been touched upon a little bit in our participants' presentations, but we really did talk a lot about what was the role of this archive during times of crisis, and can an archive really enable healing during times of crisis? And how do we think about the ethics of care and responsibility while building an archive of the pandemic? So again, audience and participants, feel free to jump in and raise your hand or share your responses in the chat. And Wallaby will ensure that we...
Anjana, if I could suggest,
Mm-hmm.
should we take these questions on in the chat box itself and maybe have a dialogue where everybody can see everybody and talk? Because once the screen share is going on, I think we all just can see one person, and I think last half an hour would be nice to see everyone. Should
yeah,
we do
sure.
that?
Yeah, I can put up the questions in the chat and read out the questions as well, if that works.
Thank you. And we already have some questions in the chat as well, if you want to take those.
Amazing, amazing. Okay, I'll just stop screen sharing then and just read out these questions. All right. So shall we begin our dialogue with this question and then take questions from the audience, or should we start with questions that have already been posted in the chat? Okay.
I think your opening question is good. I mean, it'd be nice to respond to that and then move on.
Yeah.
If anybody has responses. You might have to repeat it though.
Yes. So the question that we wanted to begin with was, can archives play a role in enabling healing during times of crisis? Specifically, can this kind of a public archive of the pandemic play a healing role? And how do we think about the ethics of care and responsibility while archiving the pandemic? Yes, Lavanya, go ahead. You are a bit faint, but go ahead. We'll try repeating what you say in case.
I'm going to shout. Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'm shouting. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just share one response that I got after I did the exercise. A friend and participant messaged back saying she's feeling more present, somehow more rounded after she did this round of exercise with us. And she said, go figure. So my sense was that somehow this process, it starts some sort of a dialogue, and it's a deeper dialogue, and that in some ways people find healing, but I don't know exactly how. But there is a dialogue building that archive especially empowers people within people, and that I think people find it healing. Yeah.
Thank you, Lavanya, for those insights. Does anybody else want to build off what Lavanya was saying?
I think I just wanted to add, Rebecca, I think, had said during the discussion that there's a real sense of generosity in the act of archiving. And I think generosity from the participants, so while sharing just what Lavanya said, while sharing that helps, and that might lead to a sense of comfort and healing.
Definitely, yeah. I think thinking about it through the lens of generosity is a helpful way to begin tackling these complex questions.
Oh. Sanjana, I think there are a few questions in the chat box. For,
Yes, Aparna and Mahweesh, right? Shall we take those questions? Yeah. So I think just one. So Mahweesh and Aparna, there's a question in the chat box for you. Since art is central to both your presentations, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the nature of publicness in relation to art. Do you feel cultural artifacts have been made more or less public during the pandemic?
Aparna, do you want to take this first or should I go?
I think Mahweesh, I'd like to hear from you because I've never actually exhibited, so I want to hear from you how you see that difference.
Okay. I think these are two different questions on two different tangents. First, we are sort of looking into publicness in relationship to art. Well, in case one is looking into public art, and that is something in which you are, and there can be like a contemporary 3 to 4 different sort of.
Let me clarify. Sorry, I did not mean public and art as separate words, right? So I wanted to understand the idea of publicness. So when you have an artifact and you create it, you have certain publics in mind, right? There's an audience in mind, correct? So now during the pandemic, because we are in such isolation, that sense of publicness has gone away from us, right? So how do you locate any artistic or cultural artifact in such a sense of isolation is what I wanted to say. Sorry for not articulating better.
Thank you for reiterating it. I do understand that we do have that we've lost that sense of understanding that, okay, all right, in a different sort of an exhibition, probably in Lahore or maybe in New York, we might have that sort of a people coming to witness that. But the thing is this, that even with all these virtual exhibits, there is still this engagement with public. For instance, even right now, when I sort of exhibited my idea, it's just an idea or maybe a notion, I am still interacting with you or interacting with all the other 44 participants over here. So that idea is still going out there. I'm not saying that it is something that is, we definitely have not lost that touch, or we, have lost that touch, because we're still trying to, what I feel as an artist or somebody who practices in, in making things which are interactive with people, it is something that even if it's virtual or even if the idea, if it's not touch, then probably an idea of you to think about it, an idea of you to respond to it, an idea, because even when I talk about archives, or even when I talk about, even in my previous project or this project, it is something that I in my practice, I try to incorporate that idea of manipulating a field, in which the reality of space is there. But when you're putting it into an exhibit form, you're manipulating that space there. So when you're bringing that space there, let's just say that, we're bringing the walled city of Lahore into an exhibit area. And when we're trying to manipulate that reality into an exhibit space, we're trying to bring that field and sort of trying to work around, different methodologies in which that can be sort of made, and an interaction could be made with the public. And it is fascinating because you see, the way people would interact, the way people have interacted with my work, I just say, according to my own practice, in UK, it has been completely different. If I'm experimenting with sounds and experimenting with language also. So, and, experimenting with the, with the published book, but they're interacting it with in the form of, an image in the hand, but not an image on the wall, right? So, and once they're interacting with it and they don't understand the language, they're suddenly looking into the sounds and they're suddenly are trying to understand the space in it. But the minute I place that similar installation in, let's say, walled city, and or maybe probably in Lahore in one of the institutions, the audience, and their interaction completely changes because they understand the language, they understand the story, they understand the narrative embedded in the installations, and they also understand the sense of space because there's some motorbike going around, some azan going on here and there. So that is something which it changes, especially with the difference of context, and I think that's the beauty of it. That is the idea of manipulating and also experimenting it with different sorts of people. And without those people, that interaction and the interaction of art piece and the art piece and the viewer, that artwork is not complete. Even in the project that I just showed you, the idea was to put in those English lined image, which was drafted, with miniature technique, and then somebody to actually come near it and think that, okay, I can write on it. That's something, oh my God. And, having to answer a question, what just ended for you? So first of all, and there's a pen there. So that childlike ability to actually do something, and then, to try to actually also write in a calligraphic form, which we would probably do in a 4th or a 5th grade. So I'm still actually experimenting with all of this too. But I do feel that whether, yes, it has impacted, but even the virtual space, even when I'm talking to you right now, it has given it into a different medium, a new medium, perhaps. I hope I've answered the question.
I think just to add to that, because I come from a theater background, I really depend on the communication being not one directional. So there's this, of course, there's a loss that one can already conceive what happens when you share something on the digital medium, because I don't think I'm able to really at a very phenomenological level, I'm able to really sense what the audience is, how the audience might be engaging with this work. But on the other hand, because to a large extent I have dealt with these pieces as really archives of this time, I have thought that perhaps this is at a collection stage. And I have very consciously not conceived at all where they might be exhibited. In fact, I've been very diffident about sharing them on social media. If I do share, I share very ephemerally. So I share for like half an hour to just see if someone says something, but then I kind of take it off again. And there's that struggle and conflict there too, but really, I really don't think I can conceive it's public, whether at a digital in a digital space or in a physical space at this stage, unless I really have a significant corpus of archive through these works. Yeah, I hope that answers.
Thank you so much for both your responses. I think Mithul had his hand up if he wants to also add in.
I think Mahweesh sort of covered what I wanted to say, but again, through my experience of creating work, and so I wanted to clarify if I've understood your question correctly first. You're talking about the lack of physical space because of which the artworks created are somewhat impacted. Is that?
No, not really. Part of it is that what I was trying to say is when you create a cultural artifact, you have a certain public in mind. That audience shapes your artifact, right? And that doesn't need to be an actual audience. It's your understanding of what an audience can be, that public. This pandemic, in a sense, has created a sense of isolation where such public conceptualization is very difficult for most of us. Right. So how has that altered the public nature of art is basically, and that's an open question really, because Mahweesh and Aparna had certain artifacts that they'd already shared. I just wanted to get their perspective. So hope that kind of gets a little bit clear.
No, of course. I think it's become, in my experience and people around me who've been creating art, it's eventually been taken as a new challenge to create something within the bounds of when you talk about display space or mean, same works that were once exhibited in the physical space are now recreated for the virtual space. And I don't know if I would like to call it a loss or a gain, but it's different, and it's now recreated for a nuanced space, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you, Mithil, for those insights. I think Venkat had a couple of thoughts and questions in the chat box. Venkat, do you want to share your thoughts and related questions with the audience?
Sure, thanks for having me and thanks for these presentations, guys. I don't really have anything more to add besides what I've shared there. It's just I mean, I guess I'm posing this as a question to just get everyone's thoughts on this. If that's kind of what prompted, I can read it out again if that helps. Should I?
Yes, please, Venkat, go ahead.
So I was just asking if the archive or the archival object needs some degree of distance, by which I mean time, for us to be able to filter or curate or reflect, and then for it to surface as quote unquote the archival object and not the other things that coexisted with it. And I don't have a good answer to this because I'm wondering, if it does need time, how much time? At the level of the country, they have things called the Public Records Act. And at an individual level, you have 24 hours or whatever it is. So, but if it does not need time, is it possible that these present day actions and decisions that occur with an awareness of the archive, if that makes sense? And this affects the very actions and decisions as they take place, because these actions and decisions are taking place with an awareness that they are possibly entering an archive. And so what's the sense of reality sort of it's flipped. So just one thing, I guess, because it's connected to this, for me, this question of intersections and spaces between what it means to document, to narrate, to describe, to curate, and to archive. So just broad thoughts, no answers.
Can I add something over here after Venkat's point? We've been on Google Classroom for about 1.5 years, and it's it's a lot of fun. But then, Google Classroom, Instagram, WhatsApp, these are 3 things that my students keep on, contacting me with. And then there are some things, certain things I end up looking in archive, which these 3 platforms have embedded in it. Especially if I've shared a resource, or especially if I've shared a thought, or maybe, reinventing some assignment, or if the semester has passed. So just the point, I'm just adding this point just in a continuation of the conversation, that whether that, do we need some time before a certain thing becomes an archive? Because if we look into digital archives, especially with these platforms, then the very next day your story becomes an archive, especially with Issue or Instagram and all these. I've never seen a Snapchat interface, but I'm sure Snapchat too, and all these things. So just adding that comment in.
Thank you, Mahweesh. Definitely, I think what you were saying connects to one of the questions that we wanted to raise, was how do we navigate the challenges of a digital archive during these times? I've put up these questions in the chat box as well, so it's easier for people to jump in if they want to. So yeah.
I think I'm still sort of stuck at the first point that you made about, do we need time, the aspect of time and distance between creating or curating. And I mean, it leads me to a larger question of when does an archive end? If you want to look at it as creating an archive or interpreting an archive, because I don't know, a question of, I mean, to me, it makes sense that whatever I have collected or gathered right now, it becomes my archive right now, but the interpretation tomorrow or 10 years later might not be the same when I have with the intention that I've curated or gathered it today, right? Yeah, I think I'm still formulating thoughts, but something that came up I wanted to share.
Thank you for that, Mithun. Yeah. I know that some of these, I know some of our participants, Rukmini and Namnith, have raised this question about the digital archive earlier in the workshop. So if you guys have anything to add, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you do have anything to add, please jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add about the digital archive. When I think digital, I always think data first. And this is something that I've been thinking about when it comes to a pandemic archive and when there's so much emphasis that you give to care. Is there a way in which we can also look at data and associate it with care? And do the two words go hand in hand or not? Yeah, these are just some of my thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, so hi. When I was actually compiling what I should do with the archives, I think it is very important that there's a purpose that exists for creating an archive, because I'm sure a lot of us will have a lot of things to put together, and a lot of us would not really know what an archive is, even though we are subconsciously putting things together. But when you are doing the practice of archiving, when you're actually engaging with it, I think it is necessary that it at least has a starting purpose to it as to why someone is doing archiving. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Namita. I think your comment on why we're archiving leads into a comment left by Amrita Wali in the chat. Amrita Wali, do you want to unmute and share these thoughts? Can someone unmute Amrita Wali?
So hi, thank you. I'm just a lay audience member. So Sanjana invited me to this workshop and I found it very, very thought-provoking. I don't have a question as such, but I just had a comment and maybe everybody can pitch in. And I'd really love to hear everybody's thoughts. So one thing I found really interesting is that idea that you can learn something even when you don't get something. So I think one of the presenters talked about how she asked a question and the reply to that question is, I don't know how to think about this. I don't know how I feel. That gives you a hint to the numbness that we are all going through emotion-wise in this space. So simply having a question to which there is no response can also give you a response. There is some significance to that. And another thing I found interesting is I've noticed, I'm a Bharatanatyam dancer, and I've noticed a lot of dancers and artists in this time struggling with, should I have performances? Should I be interacting with people today? Should I be, because they start to get this feeling of, is my art essential? There starts to be a bifurcation in your mind of what is an essential activity and what is a non-essential activity. So it was really nice to see how art creation or even interactive art, like I think Ms. Mahweesh talked about, and the touch, the paintings that people, you can fuel your thoughts about your own emotions and distress into something that you create. And then it gets a value, it becomes essential, at least to you. So in a way, in that way, the archive is helping because it's helping connecting everybody's basis, emotional basis. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on this essential, non-essential, as well as learning from even not knowing. So yeah.
I think Aparna has raised her hand. Maybe she wants to answer that. And if everybody can keep their answers tight, then we can wrap up on time.
I'm a little wary of whether I'll be audible, but because there's a really bad thunderstorm here, but I'll try. I really empathize and with what you said about a space in which that numbness can be dealt with by creating, simply because I think one of the things I had mentioned in the workshop earlier was about how how do I create an archive of the things that actually don't make it into my paintings, as elements. Because when I start something, I am very, very slow, and it's been like a really solitary conversation with things I see and the form they take and how they interact on it. And in a time where lack of stimulus has been such a big problem for a lot of us, where one thing leads to the other, this conversation with another object or process mentally and in a tactile way has been really a way in which where I see a tangible archive of my engagement with the pandemic and the time that I lived in it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. Are there any final responses from either to Amritawali's point or any of the previous questions? All right. I know it is 8:30 on a Saturday evening, so we will wrap up on time. Before we wrap up, I'd like to play a very short clip of our appeal to contribute, because our archive is still open for submissions, and we really want to get the word out there about contributing material to the archive. So I'm just going to do that for 2 minutes. All right. Are people able to view this? Are people able to see?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Right. As we've mentioned earlier, we have just begun this process of grappling with all of the relevant questions that have been raised during this time. And we envision that this process of constructing the archive, but also having to find answers to these questions, will take time. And we hope that you continue engaging with all of us and see what comes out of this process. To end with, to bring this evening to a close, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to all of our facilitators who have joined us for workshops this week. All of the translated content that you see on our slides, but also on the Curating for Culture website, has been translated with the help of the 4 translators who have been mentioned on the slides. And of course, we'd like to thank all of our participants who have put so much time, emotional and physical energy into the conversations that we've had this week. And of course, we'd like to thank Milli, without whom this event would not have been possible. Thank you all again, and good night.